I also wanted to talk to you about like protest culture, like song and dance from the streets and just like those forms that proliferate. And I found some resonance of that kind of movement with your work. What you're trying to do with your work is like,
It's funny because people say I replicate protest. But I don't replicate protest. It is protest because I think again we think about forms, we think about how protest is seen, or even kind of like made to seem as like violent and acts of like of uh, of um of anger. And yes, people might be angry, but I don't feel protest is violent. It can become violent because people agitate and aggravate. Like even like last year when I was protesting on the streets in Chicago for Black Lives Matters, my mother was like, "Don't go out," and I was like, "I have to go out. This is." And it was silent. One time we wore wigs and we walked down the street as queer allies. And but I think the idea of, first of all, the power to gather, the power to have critical mass is super important. To have that solidarity is protest. You can stand still in a group and that can be protest. And so it's not mimicking or miming. There's many forms. I think there's this idea that we've created that also puts a negative spin on protest. But I think what I do is protest through, and I love that you said song and dance, but I do it mostly through dance. And I think about the main part is that it's a gathering. It's a moment of community building. And it also is a moment of moving together. So again, that language, to move together, to be one, to find joy in that is for me an act of protest. To be joyous is also a want and a need, and to kind of do that together and to feel that joy is really important. And so that again was another hard moment because I was like, how do I create critical mass in a pandemic? And so I started to think a lot about it through gathering, but again, social distancing, but having 6 feet apart, but then to call and response. Noise as protest, singing together as protest, just even screaming together as protest. So noise, sound became a way of being collective without being physically touching. And I did another piece with Anu Vikram in California, and we created placards and we created T-shirts, and we just walked. They had a choreography where they had to like create a human chain, but the human chain meant that they had to move together, and if one person went too fast, it break the human chain or create so. And if someone went too slowly, it kind of breaks the human chain. So everyone had to kind of feel their bodies and move together slowly, but it looked like a barricade kind of coming across, and they were holding their banners and everything. And cars would stop us in Los Angeles and say like, "What are you guys doing? What are you guys protesting?" And the banner said, "We are moving change." So like an abstract kind of sentence, but we are moving change. And like, what does moving change mean? And people just were asking, and some people would join us. And it was just this kind of interesting idea of like an influx moment of thinking, how do we, like what is protest, or what are we asking for? What is this solidarity? And I like to kind of have that tension where it's like, is it dance? Is it protest? What is the form? So like my forms always take on hybridity, and within my own identity, I'm a hybrid. I'm a queer POC, Kenyan, Canadian, Indian American who is a ballet punk rocker. Like I have all of these monikers that like mix and meld, and they don't make sense. And I think something that makes me sometimes kind of like, within that space of being such a hybrid, I'm asked to always identify as a monolith. And I think that's kind of, everyone's like, well, what are you mostly? Are you more this? And of course, like, within my South Asian community, I'm more South Asian. Within my African diaspora Kenyan community, I'm more Kenyan. Or in Canada, I'm more Canadian. And so it's this kind of want to kind of place you, but I don't. And even in the way that I make my work, it's not necessarily one thing or another. It's always many things. And it can be protest, it can be dance, it can be what it wants to be. And I think that's also where I feel like the notion of the rhizome is really important. And that's the kind of idea that it is shooting out. It has this kind of flat line, but it has all these other kind of directions that it moves in.
Right. Yeah, it's like this idea of being a node in multiple networks, or the network having these like parallel sort of layers or metadata around it.
Yeah, and I love that word metadata.
Yeah, I mean, coming to the exhibition on that note, sort of, could you give us a little bit of just background on like how thinking around it started and how you sort of came on board as being jury?
Well, an invitation was given to me by the South Asian Institute, which is a new institute in Chicago. And as a Chicago-based artist of South Asian heritage, and I think I'm someone that they wanted to bring into to the mix. And so this was the first collaboration, and other things are coming up, and I'm excited to have this kind of support for our community to bring in many different voices from to Chicago, but also giving back to the community. I think it's really, really important. And so the invitation was extended. I thought the concept was really interesting. Again, using this notion of a rhizome, diasporic rhizomes, but then also the idea of a diaspora, which affects me and as I've spoken about. And so the jury was something that, I was like, yeah, let's do this. I wanted to learn about other artists, and I want to invite other artists to be part of this that I know and I think would fit into this. And so again, collectivity, right? The idea of finding people that think in this certain way was really important. So it started with a meeting with the jury and the team at SAI. And then we went through the applications together, had a conversation, made a decision, and then created the show. And that was really, 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 really important, beautiful. And it gave me a sense of like, again, to be like, this is our community. This is what we're doing for each other. And then, we had like a round table, a Zoom where we spoke, every artist presented after the show was up. And it just kind of created a nice way to understand the work even further. So that was really great. But again, the concept was really important for me. This idea of the rhizome as a diasporic kind of concept is beautiful because, yeah, we all come from a certain place, but we also then germinate and root in many other ways.
Right. I guess I wanted to ask you what your concerns were coming on board as a jury, or like were there certain works that spoke to you immediately, and what is it in those kinds of work that became important for the exhibition?
I think for me, it was work because again, it was a juried exhibition, but also one that's online. I wanted to kind of really see like how can we like implement more media works, looking at technology, because I myself am trying to see how art and dance can be implemented and augmented and supported through technology. So I was really looking for that kind of work, but also looking at the work that conceptually speaks to politics, powers that affect us, as a diasporic South Asian community. And so I was looking through the conceptual, the ideas, rigor within thought and process of concept. And, I think in the end, we came up with a really beautiful exhibition that really spoke to the different voices. I also didn't want it to just be, South Asia. There's not a monolith of what a South Asian is. So I wanted to find the diversity within that, to kind of talk to the queers in South Asia and to know what their issues are that they're dealing with. So they're different than my issues. I gave a panel at a conference in South Africa, and I had my paper ready. And then, these young queers presented their work, and I was like, this does not make sense, what I'm going to say. So I wanted to get perspective of what queer South Asians are doing, how are artists working with technology, but the concepts of what is a South Asian is also important because we're not monoliths. We come from very different backgrounds, and South Asia is not just India. That was something to kind of to really diversify within that space of the rhizome in this exhibition.
I guess the other thing that was interesting is like, or a question that emerges is, how is looking at a diaspora different from looking at sort of other markers of identity? Or does the diaspora as a concept sort of create more of this rhizomatic structure as opposed to sort of these other like subcategories that you talk about different like?
Yeah, and I think that for me is like, everyone, we want to identify through cultural identity, right? Or birth identity or lived identity. But also within that, for me, there's so much more. Like, as I said, I'm a punk rocker ballerina, like my culture is ballet. You know, I understand it. As I said, you know, our language, when we move together, like I don't need them to speak English. We can learn it through the way our bodies understand. We understand our body language. So that's one thing. But, you know, my politics come from being a punk rocker. Like, you know, early on growing up in Toronto, you know, I was very much invested in a Toronto punk scene, and my politics still come from that. You know, I remember reading Noam Chomsky in high school because that was something that I wanted to know more about. I wanted to challenge the spaces that we lived in. And so those residues, I think counterculture or alternative cultures are also very important to how we identify and the makeup of what we do. And again, you know, identify as a queer. Queer is a moniker of self-inclusivity, not necessarily about gendered space, what it is, but also not necessarily about, like, you know, also a sexualized space. But for me, it means many different things. It's an open moniker for self-inclusivity and self-empowerment. And I think those are ways of countercultures that I think that, you know, I wanted to see, you know, represented in this, you know, in this exhibition, to see how contemporaries, you know, young artists are dealing with the current times that we're living in.
To illustrate that, I mean, do you want to talk about one or two works from the show that sort of spoke to this idea of like the counterculture?
I definitely, there's a collective, I think, in Delhi, a queer collective, and I think that was very much. I thought that the work they were doing was so important because also I think it's such a brave work to be making in India, but also the kind of rigor and power that they are pushing forward to make, you know, their identities visible and valid. Yeah, but that After Party Collective, I thought was just, you know, I just even when they presented their work, I was also very, and I've also become like more informed by them, you know, especially for within the, you know, the continent or of Asia, and, you know, like in North America, we have different needs and wants, you know, but I think the After Party Collective is like, you know, but also the after party, you know, like that concept of the party. And that's one thing, like in my work, I deal with the nightclub. I deal with like the space of safety on the dance floor in a club. Because when I was in New York living, like the dance floor was my space outside of, you know, the ballet studio or the art space. But the club was like where we came to gather, we came to space. And that's a lot of my work also responds to Pulse Orlando, because that was a space that then was infiltrated and then was made into a space that felt unsafe. And so even you know, the party is one thing, but then the after party, you know, post-party, post-pandemic, post-colonial, like this idea is kind of like, even in their titling of their collective, it's such an important space after future, you know, like it's also, again, future possibility. So